We have two presenters in the first panel, and the first one is Christos Aliprantis from the Center of Advanced Studies at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. He'll be talking about the transnational dimension of Austrian political police in the Age of Revolutions, 1830-1867. Christos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rock. I hope that you are able to listen to me and see me. For the needs of my presentation, I will share my screen. First of all, I have to apologize to at least some of you, above all Alexander, that I had to wake you up that early, but I hope I'll be able to compensate you with at least some spy stories I have gathered and I'm ready to present you. But before going to this, allow me to give you some context. As Rock mentioned when he stated the title of my presentation, I will deal with the so-called Age of Revolution, or at least the extended Age of Revolution between the 1830s and the 1860s. That is, above all, in the period after the Congress of Vienna. It is quite meaningful, I believe, to focus on police institutions during these decades, because the peacemakers in 1815 had, above all, twofold aims. First of all, they wished to avoid large-scale conflicts, large-scale wars, and secondly, prevent further revolutionary outbreaks, such as the ones that had tormented Europe throughout the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. For this reason, police institutions were reorganized and expanded after 1815 exactly in order to combat and contain the alleged activity, transnational activity of revolution networks throughout Europe, from Spain to the Ottoman Empire. For this aim to be achieved, we can observe after 1815, first, the origins of transnational political policing, and second, the origins of interstate police cooperation across Europe. It is quite meaningful, I suggest, to focus on the Habsburg Empire in that regard, due to the key role that Austria used to play as the premier police force in post-Napoleonic Europe. Policing, above all, as we are going to see, the Italian as well as the German states, and finally the Balkans or Southeastern Europe. But why focus on policing in this particular instance, in this conference, where we focus on statehood as a whole? I maintain that even if there is no adequate definition of policing, despite its prominent existence in our public debates or scholarly discussions, it is nonetheless a highly useful category, because by and large, quite a few state authorities, actually all state authorities involved in the preservation of law and order, plus certain parastate or non-state actors, can be the one or the other way characterized as police institutions. During that period of the age of revolutions, we can observe that policing held a vital aspect, was a vital aspect in statehood, due to the extended, of course, insecurity, precariousness that the state and social elites felt in the given time. And nonetheless, even if Austria in general, or even Prince Metternich in particular, have been long characterized as key forces in political policing, there are still few studies focusing on police officials or secret agents below them. I hope to do something about that by focusing on these neglected, less known actors in political policing, that is, mid or lower rank police officials. When it comes to the structures of policing and above all political policing in the Habsburg Empire, we can observe its early beginnings already in the period under Joseph II, when the high-ranked state functionary, Johann Anton von Pegen, whom we can see in our right picture above, assumed the responsibility to organize the first police ministry in the history of the Habsburg states. Later on, in the decades after 1815, Joseph von Sedlinski assumed the direction of this police authority, the so-called Polizeihofstelle, being mainly responsible for interior political policing, while the Chancellor and Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich was predominantly responsible for policing abroad. It is noteworthy to emphasize that narrowly defined, the personnel of these police authorities remained quite limited. So a handful, a few dozens at best, of police functionaries. Yet, we should also add that this political policing mechanism, the mechanism of policing of political opposition, was also, to a notable extent, conducted by other fields, in other fields of state activity, such as the gendarmerie, the border police authorities, and even the diplomatic and consular personnel abroad, above all when it comes to policing radicalism and agitation across borders. To these state actors, narrowly defined, we should also add a variety of non-state or parastate actors, informers, denunciators, agents, and so on, that inhabited, so to speak, a gray area between what can be called state and what was not. Having these initial observations in mind, we can proceed now and try to map the quite complex activity of Habsburg police officials and agents abroad. Let us begin by the territories of the German Confederation. In this aspect, the revolutions of 1830 held a quite meaningful position for the early organization of Habsburg policing structures abroad. We can observe first of all, the establishment of the so-called Mainz Information Bureau a few years after the uprisings in Western Germany in 1830. So the Bureau was active between 1833 and 1848. It was established by Metternich and headed, first of all, by the experienced Austrian police functionary, Karl Noe or Nordbeck, and secondly, in the 1830s, and secondly, by Josef Planer von Engelshofen in the 1840s. In this case, the basic tasks, so to speak, of the Bureau was the gathering of police reports, the checking of the daily, newspaper correspondence and press covering in general, as well as the recruitment of police agents in order to surveil political opposition abroad. It is very useful to also emphasize in this regard the continuity before and after the revolution of 1848. Both heads of the Mainz Information Bureau, Noe and Engelshofen, remained active in policing even after the 1848 revolution. And that was also true for the majority of the agents that was employed during the Metternich era. Moreover, we can also see that even from a financial point of view, we have a great expansion of policing and policing personnel in Germany during and Ahmed's during the post-revolutionary periods, in comparison to the period before. From an annual expense, from annual expenses of about 20,000 gulden before 1848, we can see the expansion of the expenses of police purposes for surveillance in Germany to 100,000 gulden in the 1850s. Among the personnel that this budget was able to pay belonged before and after also 1848 newspaper editors or journalists such as Hermann Ebner, foreign police officials such as Jakob Zulerner, both from the state of Hesse, and even political exiles and former revolutionaries who, for the sake of monetary compensation or pardoning, had joined their former enemies, such as Bernhard Lysius or Paul Centowitz, both based in Paris beyond the German Confederation. Eventually, we can observe the weakening of this sort of political policing web in the 1860s during a period of, so to speak, liberalization in the Habsburg states, especially following the Ausgleich. I fully realize that at least some of you may find this term liberalization problematic, and I would be happy to discuss it afterwards. Let us proceed now to the second sphere of Austrian political policing, turning southwards, that is, across the Italian states. Unlike Germany, where the Habsburg Empire shared actually influence with Prussia, across the Italian peninsula, Habsburg influence remained predominant throughout the period under consideration. In this case, the establishment of a police cooperation initiative under the Habsburg scepter, so to speak, was easier. And these experiments, it can be said to observe following both revolutionary outbreaks after 1821 and after 1848, where the governments in Vienna and the provincial centers in Milan and Venice established cooperation initiatives with the friendly governments of Parma, Tuscany, the Papal States, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and also to an extent even with Piedmont. The fear and insecurity that especially the revolutions of 1848 had triggered across the Habsburg authorities in northern Italy became visible after 1848 by the geography of secret agents in the north of Italy. Therefore, in 1853, about 40% of Habsburg secret agents across the empire, that is, was stationed in either Lombardy or Venice. So we can see 129 out of 314. Most of them came out of either impoverished nobles who had a need for money, booksellers, journalists, teachers, and so on. That is literally strata, so to speak. Among them, we can pick a case, that is the case of Adolfo Falconetti, whom I have chosen to present you very briefly. Unfortunately, I was unable to find the picture, but nonetheless. Falconetti, so, was a Venetian and a teacher in Trieste, who, like many others, he joined the revolution of 1848 in Venice, only to be defeated and pushed into the margins of law afterwards. In order to get a second chance in his life, Falconetti approached the police director of Milan and spied for his own behalf across Lombardy and later on in Turin and in Piedmont in the early 1850s. In the following years, Falconetti was sent in Bologna, in the center of Italy, and later in Modena, when he maintained his surveillance activity during the late 1850s before retiring following the Italian unification in Modena, and spent his last years as a librarian and archivist there, taking into account, benefiting from his earlier expertise as an educator and an intellectual. Finally, we came into the last area of Habsburg interest, that is Southeastern Europe, the Balkans. In this case, the Balkans were of notable significance for the Habsburg Empire even before the late 19th century. Since the times of the Greek Revolution in the 1820s, the government in Vienna was keen in maintaining or trying to maintain security and stability in the region against what was considered to be extended lawlessness. In this case, we can observe certain differences in comparison to the German and the Italian territories. That is, above all, the privileged role of consuls, of secret agents, and also of the Austrian Lloyds in gathering information and creating an Austrian security nexus, an Austrian policing web in order exactly to help gather information and preserve lawlessness and insecurity to an acceptable degree. Again, I have picked a case of what I consider to be a typical secret agent in order to show to you what was a typical pathway for such an individual. We have here thus Gabriel Yasmagi, for whom I was fortunate enough to find a picture, as you can see down right. A Viennese by birth and a Levantine Hungarian by origin. He entered service around the early 1840s as a spy, and soon enough came to head the Austrian spy network in the Ottoman Empire against the Italian and the Hungarian political emigres after 1849, Kossuth, Battiani, and so on. Later on, in the 1860s, when the fear of political exiles was no longer prevalent in the Ottoman Empire, Yasmagi moved to northern Italy and Trieste, where he kept surveilling and reporting for the authorities in Vienna. And finally, he got retired in the early 1870s and, impoverished enough, emigrated to the US, when he passed away in New York in 1881. In closing, because Ro can imagine I have to finish soon enough, I choose to finish with a quote with a short text written by Alexander von Bach, the Austrian police and interior minister in the 1850s in neo-absolutism, that illustrates adequately enough the extent, the stretch of the Austrian police network, at least in the 1850s and 60s. Bach wrote, therefore, I quote, that this invisible chain of contacts, of agents, of informants, that is, which has been expanded with great success in the Orient and is directed from its center in Vienna, is already stretched through Belgrade and Constantinople to Aleppo and Kütahya, and from Paris to London, Geneva, and Hamburg. Therefore, you can really understand this pan-European scope of Austrian political policing in the given era. I also hope that this focusing on certain non-state or para-state actors justifies the inclusion of this presentation in this conference of the Habsburg civil service beyond the state apparatus, as the title went, and allow us therefore to understand how statehood was evolved outside the narrow limits of who belonged to the state and who did not. Closing, we are also, based on what we heard before, able to understand the importance of individuals staffing this police mechanism below and beyond leading statesmen in the given periods. We understood how these individuals inhabited a gray area, so to speak, between state and society, and also grasped some basic features of what meant to be a secret agent and what mattered actually for those who wished to make a career in this rather dangerous or unpredictable sector. Mobility, literacy, local contacts, and social capital, as we saw in Falconetti or Yasmagi's cases, were of absolutely vital significance for those who wished to become something like a James Bond, or so to speak, or Javert by the standards of 19th century spying and policing. And remains, despite their seemingly marginal role, they occupied a highly significant place in what was considered as key instruments of Habsburg security policies for most of the 19th century. I shall finish here. I believe, Roque, within my time limits, and I will thank all of you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions.